The air in the conference room hung thick with tension, the kind that made the walls feel like they were closing in. Donald Trump sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his fingers drumming an erratic rhythm, his face flushed a shade of red that matched the garish tie dangling from his neck. Across from him, Karoline Leavitt, his press secretary, stood rigid, her arms crossed, her jaw set like she was biting back a storm. The staffers scattered around the edges of the room kept their heads down, pretending to shuffle papers or check their phones, anything to avoid the brewing explosion they all knew was coming. It had been a long day, a brutal one, with the media tearing into Trump over a leaked audio clip from a rally, and Karoline had been the one tasked with spinning it. She hadn't just failed, she'd lit a match and tossed it into the gasoline-soaked mess of his ego. The argument ignited over a single moment from that morning's press briefing. Trump had watched it live, pacing the room like a caged animal, as Karoline faced a barrage of questions about the audio, where he'd ranted about deporting half the country's workforce. She'd been prepped, given a tight script to deflect and redirect, to paint him as the victim of a biased press. Instead, she'd stumbled, her voice cracking as she tried to pivot. And then, in a move that made Trump's blood boil, she'd admitted the clip was real, but claimed it was taken, out of context. The room had erupted, reporters pouncing like wolves, and the headlines that followed were merciless. Trump saw it as betrayal, a crack in the armor of loyalty, he demanded. And now, hours later, he was ready to unleash hell. He leaned forward, his chair creaking under the shift of his weight, and fixed her with a stare that could have melted steel. His voice, when it came, was low at first, a growl building in his throat, accusing her of tanking his image, of handing the enemy a loaded gun. Karoline didn't flinch, not yet. She fired back, her tone sharp and cutting, insisting she'd done her job, that the press was out for blood no matter what she said. The room went silent, the staffers freezing mid-motion, as Trump's face twisted into something feral. He slammed a fist on the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot, and roared that she'd made him look weak, a word he spat like it was poison. Karoline's eyes narrowed, her posture stiffening, and she took a step closer, her own anger bubbling up, refusing to let him bulldoze her. The confrontation escalated fast, a wildfire tearing through dry brush. Trump stood, towering over the table, his hands gesturing wildly as he tore into her competence, her loyalty, her very existence in his orbit. He called her a liability, a rookie who couldn't handle the heat, his words dripping with venom. Karoline didn't back down, her voice rising to match his, accusing him of setting her up to fail with impossible expectations and a script no one could sell. The staffers exchanged glances, some edging toward the door, sensing this was no ordinary spat. Trump's temper was legendary, but this was different, personal, a clash of wills that threatened to burn everything down. Karoline's defiance only fueled him, and as he paced, his rage built toward a breaking point, the room bracing for what came next. The conference room had become a battlefield, the polished decor a mocking contrast to the chaos unfolding within its walls. Trump's pacing had turned frantic, his steps heavy and deliberate, like a predator circling wounded prey. His face was a mask of fury, veins bulging at his temples, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning humming in the background. Karoline stood her ground near the table, her fists clenched at her sides, her blonde hair slightly disheveled, from the way she'd been raking her hands through it in frustration. The staffers had all but retreated into the shadows, their presence reduced to faint rustles and shallow breaths, as if they feared drawing the wrath of either combatant. What had started as a disagreement over a press briefing was now a full-on war, personal and vicious, with no sign of either side yielding. Trump's attack shifted gears, his anger digging deeper, clawing at Karoline's core. He leaned across the table, his palms slamming down hard enough to rattle the water glasses, and unleashed a torrent of insults aimed at her intelligence, her upbringing, anything he could grab to wound her. He accused her of sabotaging him deliberately, of being too green to understand the stakes, his voice booming with a mix of paranoia and disdain. Karoline's composure cracked, her eyes flashing with a fury that matched his own. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and threw his accusations back in his face, her tone icy and precise. She told him he was delusional if he thought anyone could clean up his messes, that he'd handed her a sinking ship and expected her to swim. The room felt smaller with every word, the air electric with hostility. Trump straightened, his chest heaving, and for a moment it seemed he might lunge across the table. Instead he pivoted, pointing a finger at her like a judge delivering a sentence, and declared she was finished, that she'd never work for him again. Karoline laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that cut through the tension, and told him he didn't have the guts to fire her, not when she knew too much, not when she'd seen the cracks in his empire up close. The implication hung there, a grenade with the pin pulled, and the staffers shifted uncomfortably, realizing this was no longer just about the briefing. It was personal now, a test of who would break first. Trump's reaction was explosive, his voice rising to a bellow that shook the chandelier above. He tore into her, calling her a traitor, a snake, his words wild and unhinged, as if her defiance had stripped away the last of his restraint. Karoline matched him, stepping even closer, her own voice a blade, accusing him of cowardice, of hiding behind her while she took the hits. The confrontation reached a fever pitch, their faces inches apart, both refusing to blink. The staffers held their breath, sensing a line had been crossed, one that couldn't be uncrossed. Trump's hand twitched, as if he might grab something. Anything to hurl, while Karoline's stare dared him to try. The room teetered on the edge of violence, the outcome uncertain, the stakes higher than anyone had anticipated. The conference room was a pressure cooker, the air so thick with rage it felt like it could ignite. Trump loomed over the table, his bulk casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the light, his eyes wild with a fury that had gone beyond reason. Karoline stood inches from him, her posture unyielding, her face a mask of defiance that only stoked his fire. The staffers had retreated to the walls, some clutching folders like shields, their faces pale as they watched the clash spiral into something primal. The argument had long abandoned the press briefing, morphing into a brutal showdown of egos, each blow more personal than the last. The room vibrated with their anger, a storm that threatened to shatter everything in its path. Trump's next move was a gut punch, his voice dropping to a menacing snarl as he attacked Karoline's loyalty, questioning how she'd even clawed her way into his inner circle. He painted her as an opportunist, a leech who'd ridden his coattails and now dared to bite the hand that fed her. His words were jagged, meant to cut deep, and they did. Karoline's eyes flickered with something raw, a wound opening, but she didn't crumble. Instead, she leaned in, her own voice a whip crack, and turned the accusation back on him. She told him he was the one who needed her, that without her to face the press he'd be drowning in his own chaos. The staffers flinched, sensing the shift, the way her words landed like a slap across his face. The tension snapped taut, a wire ready to break. Trump's hands balled into fists, his knuckles white, and he took a step around the table, closing the gap between them. He towered over her, his presence suffocating, and unleashed a tirade that echoed off the walls, calling her ungrateful, disloyal, a nobody who'd be nothing without him. Karoline didn't budge, her chin lifting as she fired back, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She accused him of paranoia, of pushing everyone away until he was alone, a king with no court. The room held its breath, the staffers frozen as the two stood toe-to-toe, neither willing to give an inch. It was a collision of wills, a test of who could withstand the other's storm. Then came the breaking point. Trump's face contorted, his rage peaking, and he jabbed a finger into her chest, a physical line crossed. Karoline recoiled, but only for a second, before stepping back into his space, her own hand shoving his arm away. The staffers gasped, a collective intake of air, as the confrontation teetered on the edge of something irreversible. She told him he didn't scare her, that she'd seen through his bluster from the start, and that he'd regret this. Trump's eyes widened, a flicker of shock cutting through his anger, but it only fueled him further. He roared that she was done, that he'd bury her career, his voice a thunderclap that shook the room. Karoline smirked, a cold, defiant edge to it, and said he'd have to try harder than that. The standoff hung there, electric and unresolved, the outcome a razor's edge away. The conference room felt like a war zone after the blast. The silence that followed the chaos almost deafening. Trump stood frozen, his chest heaving, his finger still hovering where he jabbed Karoline, his face a twisted mess of fury and disbelief. Karoline stared back, her smirk fading into something harder, her eyes locked on his, daring him to make good on his threats. The staffers clung to the edges of the room, their wide eyes darting between the two, waiting for the next detonation. The physical shove had shifted something. A line crossed that turned words into weapons with real weight. The air crackled with the aftermath, but neither combatant was ready to retreat, not yet. Trump's composure splintered further, his voice erupting in a ragged bellow as he promised to destroy her, to make sure no one in his circle ever touched her again. He paced a tight circle, his movements jerky like a man unhinged, ranting about loyalty and betrayal, his words a jumbled mix of threats and self-pity. Karoline watched him, her stance unwavering, and then she struck back, her tone low and lethal. She told him he was the one who'd lose, that his tantrums were a sinking ship she wouldn't go down with. She laid bare his insecurities, pointing out how the world saw him unraveling, how she'd been the one holding the pieces together. The staffers shifted, some nodding unconsciously, her words hitting a nerve even they couldn't deny. The room tilted as Trump stopped pacing, his head snapping toward her, his eyes narrowing into slits. He lunged forward, not with fists, but with a final venomous assault, calling her a failure who'd crawl back begging when she realized what she'd lost. Karoline didn't flinch, her voice rising now, sharp and triumphant, as she told him she was free of him, that she'd walk out and build something he could never touch. The staffers felt the shift, a tide turning as her defiance morphed into something unshakable. Trump's face faltered, a crack in his armor, his rage giving way to a flicker of doubt. He barked at her to get out, his voice hoarse, but it lacked the fire it once had. Karoline held his gaze, then turned, her steps deliberate, her head high as if shedding a weight she'd carried too long. She reached the door, pausing only to glance back, her expression a mix of exhaustion and victory. Trump stood alone at the table, his hands trembling, the staffers avoiding his eyes as the reality settled in. She walked out, the door clicking shut behind her, and the room exhaled. Trump sank into his chair, his shoulders slumping, the fight drained from him. The staffers dispersed quietly, leaving him with the wreckage of his outburst. Outside, Karoline strode into the humid Florida night, her breath steadying, her future hers to claim. She'd faced the storm and emerged whole, while Trump sat in May. The ruins of his own making, a king diminished. The battle was over, and she'd won, not with screams, but with the strength to walk away.